the Good Shepherd contrasts very strongly with what we read in John chapter 9 and is related to that passage. There's actually no break at all in the context from John chapter 9 to 10. The chapter break is artificial, but Jesus goes from dealing with the man born blind and talking to him and healing him and everything right into talking about how he's the Good Shepherd. And if we make it far enough this morning, which we may not, but if we make it far enough, we'll see that that moment when he healed that man will come back up in John chapter 10 in the midst of all of this. So it's definitely related to what Jesus says this morning about being the Good Shepherd. And one thing to just kind of keep in the back of our minds that I don't think we'll get to apply this morning, but we will as we keep reading. But given that the leaders of God's people are so commonly referred to as shepherds, whether we're talking about God as the leader of his people or Israel's leaders, Jesus, of course, here, and even in the New Testament, another term for elders is shepherd. So given that the leaders of God's people are so commonly referred to as shepherds, that means that what Jesus says here can teach us something about how elders today should lead the church. Something that goes beyond this passage and relates to other passages in the New Testament is that Jesus is the chief shepherd of the church. There are a couple places in the New Testament, 1 Peter and Hebrews, that come right out and say this. Jesus is the chief shepherd of the church. All the other shepherds are under him, follow his authority, follow his example. So there's a lot to learn here at multiple levels in what Jesus says in John 10. So last time we made it through the first 10 verses. Again, especially since it's been a couple of weeks, let's reread the first 10 verses so that we kind of have our context. And then we'll continue on with what Jesus says about himself as the Good Shepherd. So this is John 10, 1 through 10. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. All right, so in this passage, Jesus says he is the door of the sheep. He doesn't say he's the good shepherd yet. That's coming in what we're about to read. But in these verses, he says he is the door of the sheep. He says that all who came before him are thieves and robbers. He says if the sheep enter the sheepfold by the door, by Jesus, they will have abundant life. They will go in and out and find pasture. They'll have abundant life. And as Jesus says at the very end of this, he came so that his sheep could have that life and have it abundantly. So we talked some last time about how much this contrasts, and we can see it very plainly in verse 10, how this contrasts with the thieves and robbers. They come to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus comes for life. So Jesus comes for life. The robbers come for death. Complete opposite goals. And we talked about how the thieves and robbers in this context, in light of what happened in John chapter 9, seems to include the Jewish leaders, especially, again, given the way they treated the blind man in John chapter 9. So anyways, that's a little bit of a review from last time, but we're ready to keep on reading now. And what comes next is where Jesus shifts from saying he is the door of the sheep to saying he is the good shepherd. That's what comes next. So let's read together verses 11 through 13. Would somebody like to read this passage for us? Thank you, Barbara.
I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep.
Okay. I mentioned this last week because it can be confusing. Jesus just said he's the door in last week's passage. Here he says he's the shepherd. So how is he both? Well, again, we talked about this a little bit. It is possible that Jesus as the door and Jesus as the good shepherd are really the same thing. So some folks have studied shepherding habits in cultures today that actually overlap very much with ancient culture. There's a lot of continuity in how shepherding is done. And they've suggested that sometimes the shepherd has to lay across the entrance of the sheep pen. He literally makes himself the door. If there's not a door already there, he lays across it. And so that could be what's going on here, as Jesus says he's the door and he's the shepherd. He can easily be both. But also, not necessarily. There are sheep pens that had their own gates. And so, and actually Jesus even mentioned a gatekeeper back in verses 1 through 6. So that might not be what's going on here. But even if Jesus is not both in that way, he could just be mixing metaphors. He's certainly allowed to do that, to where he can be both the entrance to the sheepfold and the one who leads the sheep. And I think we may see some more mixing of the imagery as we keep on going. But when Jesus says here that he is the good shepherd, another way to understand him is that he is the true, the genuine shepherd. That seems to be what he means. That would be a way to interpret what he means when he says he is the good shepherd. He is the genuine, the true one. He's the one who really embodies the way all shepherds should be, right? And notice what it is here that makes Jesus the good or the genuine shepherd in this passage. He lays down his life for the sheep. That's what makes him the good shepherd. And this contrasts with the hired hand who saves his own skin, right? When the wolf attacks the sheep, he saves his own skin and he flees. Because after all, they're not his sheep, right? He's just working for the one who owns the sheep. They're not his sheep, so he will save his life rather than lose it. I want us to appreciate the power of what we're reading here, like in verse 11, the power of this in light of verses 1 through 10 that we just read a moment ago and that we worked through together last week. That passage ended in verse 10 with Jesus saying that he came so that we may have life and have it abundantly. That's how last week's passage ends. Well, we see here that this abundant life is ours by the sacrifice of the shepherd. He gives up his life so that the sheep can have abundant life. He gives up his life so that the sheep can have abundant life. And that language fits exactly with what Jesus himself does, right? He dies so that we may live. He gives up his life on the cross so that we can have eternal life. And the hired hand, Jesus says, will not do this. The hired hand will hold on to his life, and when he holds on to his life, well, that means the sheep die, right? So Jesus gives up his life and the sheep live. The hired hand holds on to his life and the sheep die. And that language with the hired hand, I do think that fits pretty well still with the Jewish leaders, even though Jesus seemed to be including them as he talked about thieves and robbers in the last passage. Again, this could be Jesus just mixing the metaphors some, but they are hired in the sense that God has entrusted them with leading his flock. God has entrusted them with leading his chosen people. And yet we've seen throughout John, and it was in John chapter 9, but also earlier in the book as well, they are very concerned with holding on to their power, holding on to their status, their honor. They want to hold on to all that instead of give themselves away, right, sacrificially to lead. They're holding on to all that. And Jesus comes along, and he's a threat to all that. So they would rather hold on to those things than actually serve the flock. And again, let's think about the man born blind from John chapter 9 in light of all this. And it's because of what he says about Jesus, what the man born blind says when they question him. It's because of that they say to the man, they say, "You were born in utter sin." It says they revile him. They cast him out of the synagogue. So they are, in chapter 9 very clearly, not willing to give up the honor and status they have for the sake of the flock. So, and if that's the case, well, then they certainly won't be giving up their lives for the flock, like Jesus is talking about here. I also want us to take a moment to appreciate something that we can kind of overlook, I think, when we talk about Jesus' death. Jesus here dying in this passage specifically for his sheep. He dies for his sheep. I want us to think about that for a moment. It is immensely powerful that Jesus dies for the whole world and that he dies even for his enemies. So John 3:16 that we read many weeks ago now, right? God so loved the world, whole place, that he sent his son. In Romans chapter 5, I was preaching for that a couple weeks ago. Jesus died for us even while we were sinners, even while we were still his enemies. We can even think later in John, when Jesus dies, he's going to die for the very people who hung him on that cross, right? So he dies for the whole world. He dies for his enemies. That is all immensely powerful. But let's also not lose sight of the power of Jesus dying for those who were faithful to him. He dies for them too. He dies for his sheep. So he dies for the women disciples who are there at the cross, not leaving his side while he's hanging there. I'll get to you in just a second, Mary. He dies for his apostles. And his apostles, we know they desert him when he's arrested, but generally they strive to be faithful. And after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, they go on to be extremely amazing people of faith, and we read about that in the book of Acts. Jesus is going to say later in John that there is no greater love than that someone lay down his life for his friends. That's what he's going to say. Greater love hath no man than this, than that he lay down his life for his friends. Well, Jesus laying down his life here for his sheep definitely fits with that idea, doesn't it? He loves those who belong to him, even to the point of offering up his life for them. And so I wanted us to dwell on that for a moment, and I know you had your hand up, Mary, I'll get to you in just a second, but I'd like us to just appreciate what this says about how much he loves us as we are here faithfully every Lord's Day, and as we are seeking to serve him faithfully every other day of the week, right, throughout our lives. The Lord sees that faithfulness. He sees that desire for faithfulness. It does not go unnoticed to him. And he loves us so much that he dies for us. So yes, he dies for the world. Yes, he even dies for his enemies. He also dies for those who are genuinely seeking to be part of his people, part of his flock. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I was agreeing with everything you said there, because, Christ took on, his human and everything. He died for us for our sins, and we still mess up, of course. We're not perfect. Yeah. But what I was reading in verse number 13, where it said, the hired person, they flee because they do not care anything about the sheep. Yeah. And putting that in today's world, we have a lot of people that getting paid. They only thing they're caring about is their payroll. They're caring about how they're getting paid, not how they're taking care of the people. Yeah. And I remember years ago when I was working as a teacher assistant, and it bothered me because I got to see how some of the teachers were treat their children. Yeah. And the children kind of, they just kind of labeled the child like, okay, this child is not going to be able to learn. So it went from year to year. I'm like, okay, I can't handle this. I mean, I ended up leaving the job. I could not do that. Because what they was caring more, to me, they cared more about the pay, and the time off in the summer than they did the children. So when I kind of relate that verse to to people that's more concerned about how they're getting paid than what they are really supposed to be doing.
Yeah, yeah. And great application when you're talking about the school system. That's a good way to take what Jesus says for his kingdom and see how it can even transform situations that aren't directly related to his kingdom. When leaders only care for themselves, everyone suffers. And here, I mean, the flock dies when that's the case. But Jesus gives himself away, and that's what gives the flock life. Bob?
Yes, I was reading chapter 10. Chapter 10 has a lot of meat for us to digest. And I look at Jesus being the door. He is the entranceway, he's the pathway, he's the gate to protect, as a shepherd, to protect the sheepfold. If we look at the verse there, it says, I am the good shepherd. It didn't say, I am a good shepherd. Because if he says, I am a good shepherd, that means there's a lot of shepherds out there.
Yeah.
But he says, he qualifies it and says, I am the good shepherd. I am the protector of my sheep. And I want to go on and say the fact that the sheep knows the voice of the shepherd. They know, they know each other.
Yeah.
And that means that there's a great relationship between those two. It makes it even better for us even today.
Yeah, and what you're saying, you're right. That's been in what we've read, and that idea of the sheep knowing the shepherd, that's going to be even more prominent in what we read next. Yeah. Okay, so Jesus is the good shepherd because he lays down his life for the sheep. And what Jesus says next, verses 14 through 16, he's going to repeat. He's going to state again that he is the good shepherd, and he's going to repeat why. And saying it twice is a way to really emphasize it. But as he repeats it, he also gives us some more information, some more understanding of why he is the good shepherd. This is verses 14 through 16. Barbara, if you would be willing, if you could read that for us.
I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd.
Okay, so here, Jesus is the good shepherd who deeply knows his sheep, and they deeply know him. That's what we see in verse 14 and 15. This is really not new. So going back to what we read last week, this is verses 3 and 4. Jesus says that he calls his own sheep by name. So that means he definitely knows them, right? And he also says they hear his voice and not the voice of strangers. So the sheep definitely know the shepherd, right? So this is something that Jesus has already said earlier. But what Jesus says here really takes that degree of knowing to a deeper level. He says he knows the flock and they know him in the way that he knows God the Father and the Father knows him. That's analogous. If we think about that for just a moment, we're talking about a very deep kind of knowledge. Think about how well Jesus knows the Father and the Father knows him. And he's going to talk more about that deep kind of knowledge between him and the Father later in John. But this is more the kind of knowledge like the way spouses just know each other inside and out, who've shared life together for a long time. Or best friends can basically finish each other's sentences. Or little brothers or sisters who are growing up and they're really close. I mean, they know each other inside and out. It's a lot like that, but it's even more than that. Those are just little glimpses of the kind of knowledge that Jesus is talking about here as he talks about his relationship with the Father. And that, he says, is like the way he knows his sheep and the sheep know him. So again, we're seeing here just how deeply Jesus not only loves the world and loves his enemies, both of which are very true and need to be emphasized a lot, and they are in Scripture, but he also loves his friends, his disciples, his sheep. We see that here. And this type of love is going to come back up later in John, shortly before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. Just a couple of examples here. John 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, talking about his followers, he loved them to the end. And then this is Jesus talking to his followers during that last meal. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. There's a couple of examples that will come later of the same love that we're reading about here. Also, I'd like us to appreciate there's a link that is made here in Jesus knowing his sheep. So the Father knows Jesus, and Jesus knows the Father, right? But then also here in this passage, Jesus knows us, and we know him. So Jesus forms a link of knowledge that connects us to the Father. And another way that Jesus is going to say this later in John, basically, is to know Jesus is to know the Father. He will say, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. And so this is something that's going to become more explicit later in John. But this is also worth dwelling on, I think, because if we're not careful, and I don't know that we may not intentionally do this, but it can just easily happen. We can sometimes slip into having our favorite member of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. We have our favorite member of the Trinity. Or maybe sometimes we feel really drawn to Jesus, but maybe not so drawn to God. And to some degree that's understandable, because Jesus being God in the flesh, he's more, we can relate to that a little bit more than a God whose image we can't even fathom, right? I understand that. But still, sometimes this can become distorted. And I've heard it said, and you've probably heard it said many times as well, some will especially say, and maybe you felt this yourself, and it can be an understandable feeling at first. It's not a place to stay. We want to grow. But maybe sometimes you've heard folks say, like, maybe they really love Jesus, but the God of the Old Testament, they just would really, they'd really rather do without that God. Maybe you've heard that kind of thing before. But what we see here is so important as a corrective to that. Jesus doesn't just want us to know him. He does want that. But he doesn't just want us to know him. He wants us to know the Father. And to know one, to know Jesus, is to know the Father. And he wants us to know the Father. And so God wants us to know him in all his fullness. Father, Son, and Spirit. And that knowing God as God the Spirit is going to come up later in John. But God wants us to know him in all of his fullness. And in the new covenant, now that Jesus has come, Jesus is really the link to knowing God in all his fullness. Here, again, if you know him, you know the Father. Later, he is the one who sends God the Spirit. So it's through Jesus that God has revealed his heart and character in all its fullness. So something that I hope goes kind of without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. But when Jesus talks about knowing him this way, he's clearly not talking just about intellectual knowledge. I mean, the language, I think, just makes that clear. He's not just talking about knowing all the facts of Jesus' life or having his teachings committed to memory, although that's a great thing if you do. But he's clearly not just talking about that or perfectly understanding doctrines related to Jesus, like the doctrine of the incarnation or the doctrine of the atonement. Those can be tricky things to think about, but he's not talking about just knowing all of that kind of stuff. All of that has its place, but it's part of a larger whole that is knowing Jesus relationally. This is very relational language that Jesus is using here. And that's how Jesus knows the Father. And that's how he knows us. And he says here, that's how his sheep know him. That deep relational kind of knowledge. Does that make sense? Great. Well, notice also, in addition to Jesus knowing his sheep and they know him, in verse 15, what we read in our previous passage, verses 11 through 13, comes back up. Jesus is also the good shepherd, not just because he knows his flock and they know him, but again, because he lays down his life for the sheep. This time, though, notice how Jesus laying down his life for the sheep is linked to how deeply he knows the sheep. The two are put together side by side in this passage. And so they go together. He lays down his life for those he deeply knows. So again, let's appreciate the power of Jesus dying specifically for his sheep. And we could even, this is going outside the Gospel of John, but I don't think it's inappropriate. Parable of the lost sheep in Luke leaves leaves the 99 to go after one who has gone astray. And going astray, if we're going to blend it with John 10, Jesus seeking the sheep, if we're going to blend it with John 10, he seeks an even point of dying for them, for one sheep. That's how much he loves us. I know that's blending passages a bit, but I think it's true to the spirit of both of them. In the 5 minutes we have left, Jesus shifts gears here in verse 16. So he says he knows his sheep, and his sheep know him, but he also has other sheep who are not part of this sheepfold, who are not part of this sheep pen. And Jesus says he must bring them in so that there can truly be one flock led by one shepherd. So that's kind of interesting. Jesus has other sheep, but they are not yet part of this fold. Now, if we have more than 5 minutes, I would want to open up the floor and ask, well, what's Jesus talking about? Maybe we can, well, I don't know. This is such a great conversation. I almost hesitate to just say what I think. I want to hear what you all think. We've only got 5 minutes. I'll just have to say what I think. All right. So it is easy to immediately jump to Jesus is referring to the Gentiles, and I think that is true. I'll go ahead and show my hand there. But instead of just jumping to that, we can also think about the context of everything we've read in John so far. As he talks about other sheep that are not part of this fold, think of other people Jesus has encountered in John. So think about someone like the Samaritan woman from John chapter 4. Now, she was not a true Israelite. She's a Samaritan, hated by Israelites, definitely not part of the fold, right? And Jesus brought her in, and actually brought in the whole town that she was a part of. We could also think of the man born blind from John chapter 9. Now, he is a Jew, right? He is part of God's people, but he was, as we read there, he was commonly believed to be a sinner, and the Jewish leaders cast him out of the synagogue and said, you're born in utter sin. I mean, they don't treat him like he's part of the fold, and yet Jesus brings him into the fold. By the end of John chapter 9, that man is worshiping Jesus. I mean, he's clearly been brought into the fold. Way back in chapter 4, this was a tiny healing, didn't receive a lot of space, and we worked through it pretty quickly. But Jesus healed the son of a royal official. And it's very likely, based on the way that official, the Greek term for him and things like that, it's very likely that he serves in the court of King Herod. Okay, well, the Jewish people did not like King Herod. He did not respect the law of Moses. He did not follow it in his own court. He had Gentiles even who worked for him, and so the royal official himself could have been a Gentile, or at least a Jew who doesn't keep the law of Moses very faithfully. So again, not people who were considered part of the fold. And Jesus wants to bring a person like that in. And we'll see some hints of this kind of thing later in John as well. And then on top of all of that, again, this fits with what the Christians reading the Gospel of John would know, because they know the rest of the story. They know what happens like in the book of Acts, and also it would apply to their personal lives. They know that the gospel eventually goes beyond the Jewish people to reach Gentiles as well, all across the world. And Gentiles, that's definitely people who are not part of the fold. And Jesus wants to bring them in. And as a matter of fact, most Christians reading Gospel of John, a lot of them may not have been part of the fold. They may have been Gentiles who were converted. And so when they read verse 16, they're like, oh, yep, he did have other sheep not part of the fold, and I was one of them, right? Because Jesus wants there to be one flock under one shepherd. The bell's going to ring in 1 minute. I wanted to also, in light of verse 16, I want us to read from Ezekiel 37. I think we'll save that for next week. Really similar language in Ezekiel to what Jesus says here in verse 16 that I think is very illuminating. But before the second bell rings, any questions or comments on verses 14 through 16? Go ahead, Joe.
So, if you remain in the context and in the time, but what I've often thought was that not of this fold, if you apply it today, might be denominations.
Oh, okay. So Ms. Joe is asking if this relates to denominations today. Well, the second bell just rang, so let's talk about that next week, because the children are about to come in. But great question. If you want to bring that up next week, we certainly can. All right, thank you.